So today I'm going to be walking through how I make and add puff sleeves to my projects. This is particularly for stretchy fabric, but you could also use woven fabric. I just use stretch fabric in this tutorial. I've tried to keep everything as beginner friendly as possible, and I think that's everything, so let's get on with the video. So I'm starting out with two of my puff sleeves cut out. This fabric is a four-way stretch jersey. It's 95% cotton, 5% elastane, which is the kind of fabric that my patterns are intended for. But you could also use this pattern with a woven fabric if you're attaching it to a different kind of top, because the mix and match tops that these go with of my patterns are also intended for a stretch fabric, but of course you can attach them to whatever you like. You might just want to size up on the sleeve. So I'm going to first walk through how I prepare the top to add the sleeve to. If you want to skip to me actually adding and making the sleeve, then I will leave a timestamp on the video now. So for my top pieces, I'm going to be using two of the patterns from my mix and match tops. So I have the round neck here and then the square neck side. Obviously you can use whichever ones you want, and you can use not even my patterns as well. So to start this off, I'll just start with the round neck side, but this is going to be exactly the same instructions for the round neck and the square neck, or any of the tops from the mix and match tops pack, whichever one you want to use. And then I'm just going to take my pins and pin around this neckline. Then I'm going to do the same for the square neck side. And then I'm just going to sew straight around this neckline. The round neck will be a little bit easier just because it is curved lines rather than these quite tight corners that you've got here. So I've got both of my necklines pinned in place here. I'm just going to go and sew this with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch. And then once I have sewn this seam in place, I'm going to take some flat braided elastic. This is completely optional, and lay that straight on top of the seam that I will have already sewn. So I'm just going to lay that around here. The easy way to do it if you're using the square neck piece is to pull that edge kind of straight, and then you can just sew straight along. So I'm just going to go and sew those in place. So this is how that looks once the neckline is sewn in place and I've added the flat braided elastic. Again, the elastic is completely optional, and you can just prepare your top in whatever way you want. This is just how I like to do it. So I'm going to take this piece, which is the square neck piece, and turn it to the right side out. Basically, whichever one you're using of the patterns that has the lower neckline, you want to turn to the right side out so it looks like that. And then I'm going to place it up inside the round neck piece, which should still be inside out. I'm just going to match up the straps and pin that in place. And then the same for the other side. And then pin that in place on that side. And then you should have two tops kind of combined here. I'm just going to go and sew along that top edge on both sides with my overlocker. Again, you can use a zigzag stitch. So now that I've got these edges sewn in place, I'm just going to fold my top out so it is laid out flat like this. If you want to, you can skip all of that and just start by sewing these edges together, but the way that I've done it skips having to finish off the neckline, which I love. So now I'm actually going to put this to one side so we didn't need to lay it out flat yet, and I'm going to grab my puff sleeve pieces. So to turn this into a puff sleeve rather than the flat sleeve that we've got here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow along this very top edge as close to the edge as I can with some shearing elastic, which looks like this. You can get this on Amazon, and that is essentially going to gather this top edge for me. There is a guide on the pattern. You can see it here, which is the bold line on the pattern. The other lines are like a dotted line, and this is going to show you how big you need your sleeve to be for it to fit into the top pattern. So you need to gather it this amount, and that's going to depend on the tension of your sewing machine. So I'm going to go along and sew straight along here with shearing elastic just in my bottom bobbin, not in the top. The top's going to have regular thread. I'll show you in a second. And then depending on how much tension I have, I might need to gather it some more, or I might be able to leave it as it is. If you're using a woven fabric, you can skip the shearing elastic and just use normal thread and then gather it by hand. I will show you on my sewing machine what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to follow along the very top edge as close to the edge as I can, and then I'm going to follow along this bottom edge, but I'm going to do it about 2 inches above the bottom edge. So I will show you that now. So I've just got my normal sewing machine here. I've got the top threaded up with just normal thread, and then I'm going to take my shearing elastic with my bobbin. I'm just going to hand wind this because you don't want it to be too tight, which the machine will probably make it a little bit too tight. And then once you've got as much as you think you need on there, I'm just going to place my bobbin in and thread it up as I normally would. And then catch that with the normal thread and pull it through. So then I'm going to take my first sleeve, and like I said, I'm just going to follow along as close as I can to this top curved line. Don't need to secure the stitch in place or anything by reversing. I'm just going to use a normal straight stitch for this. And then I'm going to cut that off, but I'm going to leave a good amount so that I can tie it off later. So then the top of the sleeve will look something like that. And now I'm going to repeat that process, except it's going to be on the bottom of the sleeve this time, and instead of sewing as close to the edge as I can, I'm going to sew about 1.5 to 2 inches up. Doesn't have to be super precise, but you want to try and keep it the same amount all the way along. So one of the good ways to do it is using these lines on your machine. I know that this one here is 1.5 inches away from the needle, so I'm going to follow along that line for the whole length of this. And then again, just trim that off, leaving a good amount of thread left. And then this is how your sleeve is looking. It should be starting to look like more of a puff sleeve now. I'm going to go and repeat this for the other side, and then I will show you the next steps. So at this point you should have 2 sleeves that look something like this. So you've got the top edge gathered by the shearing elastic, and then you've got this section about 1.5 inches above the bottom hem. So now I'm going to take my pattern back, and hopefully you can see where the guide is here that's got the bold line. You'll definitely be able to see it in person. So it goes to about here at the bottom and here at the top. And now you just want to measure up with the sleeves that you've made and see if the size is correct. So for this one, measuring the bottom up, it is about right. It doesn't need to be perfect. And then again, with the top section, again, that is around about right. It's quite difficult to do with the gathered piece. If you need to make it a little bit smaller, you just pull on these threads. at either end. And if you haven't used shirring elastic because you're making a woven sleeve, you will need to do that anyway. So you just gather it manually by hand. So once you've done that and you've found that the sizing is right, I'm just going to mark in my center point. There is a center point on the pattern, but I think for this purpose it's easier to just fold it in half and then mark that in place. You've just got a center mark there, and then I'm going to do that for the other piece, and then I'm going to grab my top back and lay it out flat like I had it before. So now that I've got my top piece laid out, I'm going to take one of my sleeves. At this point you can, if you want to, tie up these edges to make sure nothing comes undone, but generally you are going to be sewing along these edges where the end of the seams are, so it should be absolutely fine as long as you don't knock it too much while you are pinning things in place. So I'm going to find that center mark that I left, which is here, and I'm going to line that up with right sides facing together to the seam at the top of the straps. I'm going to pin that in place. And then I'm going to take the end of that top section of the sleeve and pin it to this edge of the top, which is where the kind of armpit area is going to be. And then do the same for the other side. And then I'm going to put some more pins in between those sections that I've just pinned in place. So you're trying not to stretch anything or to get rid of the gathers. And then once that is all pinned in place, you can check that it's all correct by folding it out and then folding the top. So you can see that that is the kind of puff sleeve that you're going for. I'm going to fold that back. And now I'm going to follow along and just sew along this edge, being really gentle, making sure to not pull this puff sleeve too much because you will flatten out the gathers. I'm just going to sew straight along here. I'm going to do that for both sides. So I'm going to be using my overlocker to do this, but you can also just use a zigzag stitch. So I'm just going to start at one end of the sleeve, remove that pin, very, very easy to miss a layer, whether that's one of the layers of the top or the sleeve. So I'd recommend going very, very slowly as you do this. I'm just going to follow along that edge. Just taking the pins out as I go. Just if you are using an overlocker, make sure you don't go too close that you are cutting part of the elastic off. You also want to make sure as you're going that the part of the sleeve that you're sewing down here isn't tucked under, which is quite easy to miss that because when it's gathered it does just kind of tuck itself underneath. So then I'm just going to go along and check that I got everything at every point around that armhole, and it is looking pretty good. So I'm going to go and repeat all of those steps for my other side. So that's how that should look once everything is sewn in place. And I'm going to fold it along the shoulder seams with right sides facing together. So that's going to be like this. And now I'm going to pin down the side of this sleeve and then down the side of the top. So I've just got the pins along this edge of the sleeve and then down the side of the top. I'm going to repeat that for the other side. So now I'm just going to go in and sew along these two edges on both sides. I'm going to use my overlocker. You can use a zigzag stitch as well. So I've just finished sewing all of those edges in place. Because I was using an overlocker, I was able to cut off all of the loose threads as well. So if you are just using a normal sewing machine, you can cut all of those off at this point. You can turn this to the right side out. So that is how your sleeves are looking. At this point, all you need to do is to finish off the hems. So either you can leave them as they are, I think they look quite good, just raw hems, or you can finish them with some lace, or the way that I like to finish my sleeves, this is especially handy for jersey fabric, I just like to take some interfacing at the bottom edge here. In fact, let me just zoom in. I like to take my interfacing at the very bottom edge of the sleeve, fold the sleeve up over the interfacing and press that in place. And this is fusible interfacing, so it will hold together once you use heat on it. And then I like to go in with a zigzag stitch on top of it. So you can finish the sleeves in whatever way you want, but that's how I'm going to do it. So I'll show you how that looks at the end. So this is what the sleeves look like when I've just pressed them in place with that interface in. And now I'm just going to follow around that seam with a zigzag stitch. So just to secure my hem in place where I've pressed it, I'm just following around this edge with the medium size of my zigzag stitch. So I've got the sleeve around my machine here. I'm just following that round. And then coming round and joining it to where I started the stitch. And then once you've finished going around that bottom hem, then the sleeves are done. So once your hems are done, you can either finish off the bottom of this edge so that you have a top, or you can add a skirt or trousers to make a dress or playsuit.